Wealth Begins with Restraint. The Wealth Forge audiobook collection, original content and copyright notice. This audiobook manuscript is an original work created specifically for the Wealth Forge collection. The concepts explored throughout this audiobook are inspired by timeless principles of discipline, delayed gratification, emotional maturity, stewardship, long-term thinking, and financial wisdom. Why restraint matters more than most people realize. Most people think wealth begins with money, a bigger paycheck, a better investment, or a lucky opportunity. But real wealth usually begins much earlier. It begins in private decisions. The ability to pause, the ability to wait, the ability to resist unnecessary impulses. In other words, wealth begins with restraint. Restraint is not glamorous. It does not create instant excitement. It rarely receives applause. It often feels invisible. But restraint quietly shapes nearly every part of life. Financial stability, emotional peace, strong relationships, clear thinking, long-term success. Without restraint, people drift toward emotional decision-making, impulse spending, overcommitting, constant distraction, lifestyle inflation, and short-term thinking. Modern culture encourages this. Everything is designed to pull attention away from patience. Buy now. Upgrade now, react now, consume now. People are constantly encouraged to satisfy temporary emotions immediately. But emotional impulses often create long-term consequences such as debt, stress, regret, and even burnout. Disciplined people understand something important. Every yes costs something: money, time, energy, and attention. Restraint creates space between emotion and action. That space changes everything. It allows people to think instead of react, to evaluate instead of impulsively consume, to build intentionally instead of emotionally. This audiobook is not about extreme deprivation. It is not about fear. It is not about guilt. It is, however, about learning how to build a life with intentionality, a calmer financial life, a steadier emotional life, a life not controlled by endless consumption. Because real freedom is not found in endless indulgence. Real freedom is often found in self-control. The people who build lasting stability usually learn how to manage themselves before they manage larger opportunities. And throughout this audiobook, one truth will continue appearing again and again. Restraint protects the future. Every disciplined pause, every wise decision, every avoided impulse. These moments quietly shape long-term outcomes, not dramatically, consistently. And over time, consistent restraint becomes a powerful form of wealth. Chapter 1. The Hidden Cost of Impulse Living. Many people underestimate how expensive impulsive living becomes, not only financially, but emotionally, mentally, and relationally. Impulsive living creates instability, and instability quietly drains peace. Most impulsive decisions do not feel dangerous in the moment. That is what makes them so powerful. A purchase here, a distraction there, another emotional reaction, another unnecessary commitment. Individually, these moments seem small, but repeated impulsive behavior compounds. Eventually, people begin feeling overwhelmed without fully understanding why. Because the problem was never one dramatic decision. It was a pattern. Modern culture encourages impulse constantly. Advertisements are carefully designed to bypass thoughtful decision-making. Most marketing does not sell products. It sells emotions, comfort, status, confidence, escape, belonging. Now, people often spend emotionally while believing they are spending logically. That emotional spending creates short-term relief, but long-term pressure. And pressure creates stress. One of the greatest financial skills is learning how to pause before acting emotionally. Pause before purchasing. Pause before reacting. Pause before committing. That pause creates clarity. Disciplined people learn that not every emotional desire deserves immediate action. That realization creates freedom. Impulse living also affects time. Many people say yes too quickly. Too many obligations, too many distractions, too many unnecessary demands. Eventually, their schedule becomes emotionally exhausting. Busyness becomes normal. But constant activity does not always create meaningful progress. Sometimes it simply creates exhaustion. Restrained people become selective, selective with spending, selective with energy, selective with attention. That selectiveness protects peace. The inability to restrain impulses also damages focus. Modern life constantly competes for attention. Notifications, entertainment, comparison, and noise. People who cannot regulate attention often struggle to build meaningful momentum because focus requires restraint too. Every distraction carries a cost. Emotionally mature people begin asking different questions. Does this actually improve my life? Does this align with my goals? Will this matter long term? Those questions slow emotional reactions, and slowing down improves decision making. There is also emotional power in learning how to tolerate discomfort temporarily. Many impulsive behaviors exist because people fear discomfort, boredom, stress, loneliness, or insecurity. Consumption becomes emotional escape, but avoidance rarely solves underlying problems. Restraint forces honesty, and honesty creates growth. People who develop restraint often become calmer because they are no longer controlled by every emotional impulse. That emotional steadiness becomes a form of strength. Not loud strength, but quiet strength, the kind that protects the future. Chapter 2. Delayed gratification creates freedom. One of the strongest indicators of long-term success is the ability to delay gratification. The ability to wait, to sacrifice temporarily for something better later. This skill affects nearly every important area of life: finances, health, relationships, career growth, and emotional stability. People who constantly prioritize immediate pleasure often create long-term instability. People who can tolerate temporary discomfort often build stronger futures. This principle sounds simple, but emotionally it is difficult. Because human beings naturally crave immediate rewards, modern technology strengthens this tendency. Instant entertainment, instant shopping, instant communication, instant stimulation. Eventually, patience begins feeling unnatural, but meaningful growth almost always requires waiting. Saving money requires waiting. Building trust requires waiting. Mastering skills requires waiting. Healing emotionally requires waiting. People often underestimate how deeply delayed gratification shapes identity. Every time you choose long-term benefit over short-term emotion, self-respect grows. You begin trusting yourself more. That self-trust matters. Financial restraint especially creates freedom. Many people assume freedom comes from spending more, but often freedom comes from needing less. A person drowning in unnecessary financial obligations rarely feels peaceful. Debt creates pressure. Lifestyle inflation creates pressure. Constant consumption creates pressure. Restrained people often experience something incredibly valuable: margin. Margin creates breathing room. Unexpected expenses feel less catastrophic. Stress decreases, and choices improve. Freedom grows quietly. One reason delayed gratification matters so much is because short-term emotions constantly change. Excitement fades, impulses fade, and desires shift. Disciplined people learn how to avoid making permanent decisions based on temporary emotions. That wisdom protects them. There is another important truth here. Delayed gratification is not punishment. It is an investment. A person who exercises consistently may sacrifice comfort temporarily, but they invest in future health. A person who budgets carefully may sacrifice temporary luxury, but they invest in future stability. Mature people think beyond immediate emotion. That perspective changes behavior profoundly. Now, one of the healthiest financial questions a person can ask is simple: will my future self thank me for this decision? That question shifts attention toward long-term outcomes. And long-term thinking creates wisdom. Many people are not financially trapped because they lack intelligence. They are financially trapped because emotional impulses repeatedly override long-term priorities. That is why restraint matters. Restraint protects future opportunities, and opportunities create freedom. Chapter 3. Why emotional spending never fully satisfies. Many purchases are emotional before they are practical. People often buy things hoping to improve emotional states, confidence, comfort, belonging, or validation. But emotional spending rarely creates lasting satisfaction. The excitement fades quickly. Then another desire appears. This cycle creates emotional exhaustion. Modern culture encourages people to build identity through consumption. The brands you wear, the vehicle you drive, what you display. Eventually, many people begin confusing personal appearances with worth. That confusion becomes expensive. Because no amount of external consumption can permanently solve internal insecurity, a person may continue upgrading lifestyles while still feeling emotionally restless, because emotional peace cannot be purchased. This does not mean money is unimportant. Your financial stability matters. Personal comfort matters. Responsible enjoyment matters. But consumption becomes dangerous when it becomes an emotional escape. Many people spend most aggressively during emotional discomfort. Stress, loneliness, comparison, or frustration. Temporary spending creates temporary relief, but temporary relief often creates long-term consequences. More pressure, more debt, and more anxiety. One of the healthiest things a person can learn is emotional awareness. Why am I wanting this right now? That question creates pause, and pause creates clarity. Disciplined people learn how to separate genuine value from emotional impulse. Not every desire deserves immediate fulfillment. This realization becomes deeply freeing because eventually people stop feeling emotionally controlled by every craving. They become more intentional. Intentional people often experience greater peace because they stop constantly chasing temporary emotional highs. There is also emotional wisdom in learning contentment. Contentment does not mean lack of ambition. It means appreciating what exists while still pursuing healthy growth. Without contentment, consumption never ends. There will always be a newer product, a larger house, or a more impressive lifestyle. Comparison fuels endless dissatisfaction. Disciplined people interrupt this cycle. They stop asking, what will impress people? And start asking, what actually improves life? That shift changes spending behavior dramatically. Emotionally grounded people usually make steadier financial decisions because they are not constantly spending to regulate their emotions. They develop peace independent of consumption, and that independence creates strength. Chapter 4: Restraint Protects Relationships. Many people only think about restraint financially, but restraint matters relationally too. Words require restraint. Emotions require restraint. Reactions require restraint. Without emotional restraint, relationships become unstable. Impulsive reactions create damage quickly. Anger, defensiveness, and harsh communication. Temporary emotions can create permanent consequences. Disciplined people learn how to slow emotional reactions. Not suppress emotions, manage them. That distinction matters. Emotional maturity does not mean pretending emotions do not exist. It means refusing to let emotions control behavior completely. This is difficult during stressful seasons. Financial pressure, fatigue, and disappointment. Stress often lowers emotional patience. That is why disciplined communication matters deeply. Many relationships quietly deteriorate because people react impulsively instead of responding thoughtfully. One restrained conversation can prevent enormous unnecessary conflict. Patience protects relationships. Listening protects relationships. The ability to pause before speaking protects relationships. Restrained people are not emotionless. They are intentional. They understand that not every thought requires expression, not every irritation requires escalation, and not every disagreement requires emotional intensity. This wisdom creates emotional safety. Emotionally safe relationships become deeply valuable. People feel calmer around emotionally disciplined individuals because emotionally reactive environments create exhaustion. Restrained people create steadiness. Restraint also protects relationships financially. Financial stress damages many relationships because spending behaviors are often emotional. One person overspends, another becomes anxious, and conflict grows. Shared restraint creates unity. Shared discipline creates trust. Financial honesty matters deeply too. Avoidance damages relationships, but clarity strengthens them. Mature people face problems honestly instead of emotionally escaping responsibility. That honesty builds trust over time. Trust compounds quietly. just like instability compounds quietly. There is another important truth. Restrained people often become better listeners because restraint creates space, space to think, space to understand, and space to respond wisely. The ability to remain calm during difficult conversations is one of the strongest forms of emotional discipline, and emotional discipline protects long-term connection. Chapter 5. The Discipline of Saying No. One of the most powerful forms of restraint is learning how to say no. No to unnecessary spending, no to unhealthy habits, no to distractions, no to obligations that create exhaustion. Many people struggle with this because saying yes often feels easier emotionally. Yes creates temporary comfort. No creates temporary discomfort. But mature people understand something important. Every yes costs something. Time and energy, focus and money. Without boundaries, life becomes chaotic, and chaos eventually creates burnout. Disciplined people protect their energy intentionally, not selfishly, but wisely. This is especially important in a distracted culture. People constantly feel pressure to participate in everything, every trend, every opportunity, and every social obligation. But trying to do everything often destroys focus. Focused people usually progress further because they are selective. Selectiveness requires restraint. There is emotional discomfort in disappointing people sometimes, but constantly overcommitting creates a different kind of pain. Exhaustion, resentment, disorganization. Mature restraint means recognizing limitations honestly. You cannot give unlimited energy to unlimited demands. Boundaries protect sustainability. Sustainability matters because burned out people rarely build stable lives. Saying no financially matters too. Many people spend money simply because they fear missing out. Social pressure influences spending more than most people realize. Lavish vacations, unnecessary lifestyle upgrades, personal status purchases. Often these decisions are driven less by genuine desire and more by emotional pressure. Restrained people become comfortable choosing differently. They stop needing constant external validation. That freedom changes quality of life. One of the strongest financial skills is the ability to tolerate not having everything immediately. That patience protects future stability. Disciplined people understand that restraint today often creates freedom tomorrow, temporary discomfort for long-term peace. That trait is usually worth it. Eventually, saying no becomes less emotionally difficult because priorities become clearer. Clear priorities simplify decision-making. What actually matters? Peace, health, stability, family, long-term freedom. When priorities become clear, unnecessary distractions lose power. That clarity creates calmness. Chapter 6. Wealth is easier to build than to keep. Many people focus entirely on acquiring wealth. Fewer people focus on preserving it wisely. Building wealth requires discipline. Keeping wealth requires restraint. Without restraint, increased income often leads to increased instability. Lifestyle inflation quietly consumes progress. As income rises, spending rises, expectations rise, and pressure rises. Eventually, people earning large incomes still feel financially trapped. Not because they lack money, but because they lack margin. Margin matters deeply. A person constantly operating at the edge financially experiences ongoing emotional pressure, stress increases, fear increases, and decision-making worsens. Restrained people resist unnecessary expansion, not because they fear success, but because they value stability. One of the most financially dangerous habits is trying to appear wealthier than you actually are. Image maintenance becomes expensive. Many people quietly sacrifice peace trying to maintain appearances. Disciplined people prioritize reality over performance. They understand that visible wealth and actual stability are not always the same thing. Some of the wealthiest people live surprisingly restrained lives because they understand preservation. Preservation requires patience. Patience with investing, patience with growth, and patience with compounding. Most meaningful wealth is built slowly, not dramatically. Slow, disciplined growth is usually more sustainable than emotionally aggressive decision-making. Restrained investors often outperform emotional investors because they avoid panic and impulsive behavior. Emotional decision-making destroys long-term progress. This is true beyond investing. Businesses too. Some businesses collapse not because they lacked opportunity, but because they expanded faster than wisdom allowed. Growth without restraint becomes fragile. Strong foundations matter. Disciplined people respect foundations, emergency savings, reasonable spending, and long-term planning. These things may not appear exciting externally, but internally they create peace, and peace is valuable. One of the greatest luxuries in life is not needing to constantly panic financially. That calmness changes relationships, health, and mental clarity. Restrained people often experience greater long-term freedom because they protect stability carefully, and stability compounds quietly over time. Chapter 7. Attention is one of your greatest assets. Most people think only about protecting money, but attention matters too. Attention shapes identity. Whatever repeatedly captures attention eventually influences behavior. Modern life aggressively competes for attention. Notifications, entertainment, comparison, advertising, or outrage. Many people live mentally fragmented. Constant distraction weakens focus, and weak focus weakens progress. Restrained people become intentional about what they consume mentally, because mental clutter eventually becomes emotional clutter. A distracted mind struggles to build a meaningful life. Deep work requires restraint. Learning requires restraint. Even peace requires restraint. People who constantly chase stimulation often lose the ability to tolerate stillness. And that stillness matters. Reflection matters. Without reflection, people drift. Culture begins shaping priorities automatically. Impulse replaces intentionality. No. Restrained people slow themselves down enough to think clearly. That clarity becomes a major advantage. Many emotionally exhausted people are not necessarily overworked. They are overstimulated by too much noise, too much comparison, and too much emotional exposure. Eventually, the nervous system remains in constant reactivity. Calmness disappears. Protecting attention creates emotional stability. That may require boundaries. Less social media, less outrage consumption, less unnecessary distraction. Not isolation, but purposeful protection. Attention is valuable because life moves toward what repeatedly receives focus. Focused people often build stronger lives because their energy is concentrated instead of scattered. This applies financially too. Distracted people often struggle with consistent discipline. They chase trends, quick opportunities, and temporary excitement. Restrained people think long-term. They are less emotionally reactive. That steadiness protects them. One of the strongest forms of discipline is the ability to remain focused while the world constantly demands your attention. That ability is becoming increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. Chapter 8. Peace comes from living below pressure. Many people live constantly overwhelmed. Financial pressure, schedule pressure, or emotional pressure. Eventually, stress becomes normal. But normal does not always mean healthy. One of the greatest benefits of restraint is reduced pressure. Restrained living often creates calmer living, not necessarily luxurious living, but calmer living. And that distinction matters greatly. A person constantly trying to maintain expensive appearances often sacrifices peace. The pressure to sustain lifestyle becomes exhausting. Restrained people simplify strategically, not because they lack ambition, but because they value sustainability. Sustainable living creates breathing room. Breathing room changes emotional life profoundly. Unexpected problems feel more manageable. Difficult seasons become less catastrophic. Margin creates resilience. Financial restraint especially protects peace. A smaller financial burden often creates greater emotional freedom. Less debt, less pressure, and less panic. This does not mean avoiding growth. It means growing responsibly. Responsible growth protects stability. Many people quietly destroy peace-chasing lifestyles they cannot comfortably sustain. Disciplined people think differently. They ask, will this improve my quality of life or increase my pressure? That question creates wisdom. Peace also requires emotional restraint. Not every disagreement deserves emotional energy. Not every opinion deserves response. Not every problem deserves panic. Calm people protect their nervous systems intentionally. They simplify where possible. They reduce unnecessary chaos. Eventually, this creates grounded living. Grounded living feels different, slower, steadier, and more intentional. There is enormous peace in no longer trying to prove yourself constantly, no longer chasing endless upgrades, no longer needing validation from strangers. Instead, restrained people focus on building stability quietly. That stability becomes deeply valuable over time. Chapter 9. The long-term reward of self-control. Self-control rarely feels exciting in the moment, but over time, it creates extraordinary outcomes. A healthier body, a calmer mind, a stronger financial future, and more trustworthy relationships. Repeated restraint compounds, just like repeated impulsiveness compounds. This is one of the most important truths in life. Small repeated decisions shape identity. What you repeatedly tolerate becomes habit, and what you repeatedly practice becomes character. Restrained people eventually become emotionally stronger because they stop being controlled by every impulse. That self-mastery creates confidence. Not an arrogant confidence, but a grounded confidence, the kind built through self-respect. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, trust grows. You begin believing in your own discipline, and that matters deeply. Many people secretly feel emotionally unstable because they no longer trust themselves consistently. They abandon plans, ignore boundaries, and break commitments repeatedly. Self-control rebuilds integrity internally, and integrity creates peace. Long-term thinking also improves. Restrained people stop organizing life entirely around immediate emotion. They think beyond today. That perspective changes financial behavior dramatically. Saving becomes easier, patience becomes easier, and impulse spending weakens. Eventually, restraint becomes identity instead of temporary effort. That shift changes life profoundly. One of the most powerful realizations disciplined people have is this: freedom is not the ability to do everything. Freedom is the ability to choose wisely. Without self-control, people become emotionally controlled by cravings, distractions, and impulses. That is not freedom. Self-control creates options, and options create peace. There is another important truth here. Restrained living often ages better, emotionally, financially, and relationally, because stability compounds quietly. Calmer habits, steady investing, healthy boundaries, and intentional routines. These things may appear ordinary daily, but over years they create extremely remarkable outcomes. And eventually people look at the result and assume it happened quickly. They rarely ever see the years of restraint that created it. Closing. A life built carefully lasts longer. The modern world encourages speed, speed of consumption, speed of reaction, and the speed of achievement. But fast living often creates fragile living. A restrained life is different. It is slower, more intentional, and more sustainable. Restrained people learn how to pause before acting emotionally. That pause protects them financially, emotionally, and relationally. Over time, restraint quietly creates something powerful: stability. And stability changes quality of life. A stable person thinks more clearly, sleeps more peacefully, and handles difficulty more calmly. That calmness becomes a form of wealth itself. One of the most important ideas throughout this audiobook is simple. Every decision either increases pressure or increases freedom. Every impulse matters. Every habit matters. And every repeated choice shapes your identity. This should create hope, because meaningful change becomes possible through ordinary disciplined decisions. You do not need dramatic transformation overnight. You need consistency, patience, awareness, and restraint. The ability to think long-term while living in a culture obsessed with immediacy. That ability is becoming more and more scarce and increasingly valuable. The strongest lives are usually not built emotionally. They are built intentionally with careful spending, thoughtful communication, protected attention, healthy boundaries, and long-term thinking. These things quietly compound. Eventually, they create something deeply valuable, a life with less chaos, less pressure, and less regret, a life with more peace, more clarity, and more stability. That is real wealth, not merely visible wealth, enduring wealth. And enduring wealth almost always begins with restraint. So continue building carefully. Pause before reacting, pause before consuming, and pause before chasing temporary emotion. Protect your peace, protect your focus, and protect your future, because every disciplined decision quietly shapes the direction of your life. Not instantly, but profoundly. And one day you may realize the freedom you were searching for externally was actually built internally first, through patience, self-control, and through restraint. That is where lasting wealth begins. If you would like to continue applying the lessons from this audiobook in a more practical and personal way, the companion workbook for Wealth Begins with Restraint was created to help guide that process. Inside the workbook, you'll find chapter-by-chapter reflections, financial awareness exercises, emotional discipline prompts, restraint-building practices, long-term planning exercises, and guided journaling designed to help you build a calmer, more intentional life. This workbook is not about restriction for the sake of restriction. It is about creating freedom through wisdom, patience, and self-control. Because lasting wealth is rarely built through emotional decisions. It is built through consistent, disciplined choices repeated over time. The wealth begins with restraint. Companion Workbook was designed to help you slow down, think clearly, protect your peace, and strengthen the habits that quietly shape your future.